The cardboard beneath my back had grown soft from 3 months of body heat, and the occasional leak from the Honda's sunroof. I pressed my palm against the car window, watching the condensation from my breath fog the glass in small, perfect circles. Outside, the streetlight cast long shadows across the empty parking lot behind the defunct grocery store where I'd been sleeping since October. My daughter Jane's voice still echoed in my head from our last phone call. "Just sleep in your car a little longer, Mom. I'm busy with the baby coming and all. You understand, right?" I understood more than she knew. The flood had taken everything. My little house on Maple Street, my photographs, my mother's china, 40 years of carefully collected memories. Insurance covered the structure but not the life inside it. At 62, I found myself with nothing but a 12-year-old Honda Civic and the clothes I'd managed to salvage from the muddy wreckage. Jane had seemed sympathetic at first. "Of course you can stay with us temporarily, Mom, just until you get back on your feet." But temporary had stretched into uncomfortable, and uncomfortable had become impossible when her husband Frank started leaving passive-aggressive notes about utility bills and grocery costs taped to the refrigerator. The morning I'd finally packed my few belongings back into the Honda, Jane had been feeding 18-month-old Emma breakfast. She'd barely looked up from the high chair as I explained I'd be staying elsewhere for a while. "That's probably for the best," she'd said, wiping mashed banana from Emma's chin. "Frank's been stressed about the promotion at work, and you know how he gets when he's stressed." I knew exactly how Frank got when he was stressed. He got mean. He got entitled. He got comfortable treating me like an unwelcome guest in what had been my temporary home. Now, lying in the back seat of my car with a winter coat serving as my blanket, I wondered if this was what my mother had felt like in her final years. Invisible, inconvenient, easily discarded when love became too much work. My phone buzzed against my chest. A text from Jane. "Hope you're doing okay. Frank got the promotion. We're looking at bigger houses now. Baby number 2 is due in spring." I stared at the message until the screen went dark, then set the phone aside without responding. She hoped I was doing okay. She hoped I was doing okay while sleeping in a car in December in Ohio, while she celebrated promotions and house hunting and expanding families. The next morning, I drove to the public library as I did every day, parking in the same spot near the back entrance. The librarian, a kind woman named Rosa Pratt Kelly, had stopped asking questions about my daily routine weeks ago. She simply nodded when I passed the circulation desk, heading for the computer terminals where I spent hours applying for jobs, researching assistance programs, and slowly rebuilding what the flood had destroyed. It was there, on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, that I saw the email that would change everything. "Dear Louise Qualls," it began, and I had to read the sender's name twice before I believed it. Harrison, Blackwell and Associates, estate attorneys. My heart hammered as I scrolled down. "We represent the estate of your late aunt, Tilly Brendel. We have been attempting to locate you regarding a bequest in her will. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the inheritance she has left you." I sat frozen in the hard plastic chair, reading the email again and again. Aunt Tilly, my mother's sister, the one who'd moved to California in the 1980s and gradually faded from family gatherings and Christmas cards. I'd assumed she'd died years ago, lost to the natural drift of extended family relationships. But she'd remembered me. The phone call to the attorney's office felt surreal. Yes, they confirmed. Tilly Brendel had left her entire estate to me. A house in Pasadena, California. Investment accounts. Life insurance. The lawyer's voice was professional, almost bored, as he recited numbers that made my hands shake. "The property is worth approximately $850,000, he said. "The liquid assets total another $320,000. There are some debts to settle, but you're looking at inheriting well over $1 million, Ms. Qualls." I ended the call and sat in stunned silence. Around me, the library hummed with its usual afternoon activity. Students typing papers, retirees reading newspapers, children giggling in the story corner. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the homeless woman in the corner computer terminal had just inherited a fortune. The drive back to my parking lot felt dreamlike. I kept expecting to wake up in the Honda's back seat, to discover this was just another desperate fantasy born of exhaustion and cold. But the lawyer's business card was real in my pocket, and the follow-up email was real in my phone. I thought about calling Jane immediately, sharing the news, watching her face transform from distant politeness to excited interest. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Frank's notes about utility bills. Maybe it was the casual way she'd dismissed my homelessness as a temporary inconvenience. Or maybe it was the small, hard seed of anger that had been growing in my chest for months, fed by every night I'd spent sleeping in a car while my daughter slept in her warm bed, planning her expanding family. Instead, I drove to a motel, a real bed for the first time in months. I paid cash for 3 nights and took the longest, hottest shower of my life. In the mirror, I looked at a woman I barely recognized, thinner than I'd been in years, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had learned to expect disappointment. But something else was there too, something I hadn't seen in months, a spark of possibility, a hint of the woman I'd been before Frank's notes and Jane's convenient busy schedule had worn me down to nothing. I spent the evening on the motel's Wi-Fi, researching Pasadena real estate, looking at pictures of the house that was now mine. A craftsman bungalow with a front porch and mature orange trees in the backyard. It needed work, the listing photos showed, but it was beautiful. It was home. My phone buzzed. Another text from Jane. "Haven't heard from you in a few days. Everything okay?" I typed and deleted a dozen responses. Part of me wanted to share the news, to let her know her mother wasn't as helpless as she'd assumed. But a larger part wanted to wait, to see what else might reveal itself in the coming days. "I'm fine," I finally typed back. "Just figuring some things out." The next morning, I made the arrangements to fly to California. The lawyer would meet me at the property, help me understand the full scope of what Tilly had left behind. I bought a plane ticket with money I'd been saving for a security deposit on an apartment, money I'd been hoarding like a dragon guard's gold. As I packed my few belongings, everything I owned still fit in 2 grocery bags. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 months ago, the woman who'd lost everything to flood water and had accepted her daughter's grudging charity because she'd believed she had no other choice. That woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who'd learned that love could be conditional and family could be temporary. Someone who'd discovered that the people who claimed to care about you most could also be the ones most willing to abandon you when caring became inconvenient. I left the motel key on the nightstand and walked out into the December morning. The Honda started on the first try, as if it knew we were finally going somewhere better. But I didn't drive to the airport immediately. Instead, I took a detour past Jane's house, a modest colonial in a decent neighborhood, with Frank's truck in the driveway and children's toys scattered across the front lawn. The house where I'd been tolerated for 6 weeks before being gently, politely, efficiently pushed out. I sat in my car across the street, engine running, watching the windows for signs of life. A part of me wanted to knock on the door, to tell Jane about the inheritance, to see if wealth might restore the daughter who'd once called me every Sunday just to talk. But I'd learned something in these months of sleeping in parking lots and spending days in libraries. I'd learned that dignity, once lost, wasn't easily recovered. And I'd learned that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who do it with smiles and excuses and the careful language of love. I put the car in drive and headed for the airport. Behind me, Jane's house grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Ahead of me, California waited, and with it, the chance to discover who I might become when I no longer had to be grateful for scraps of affection from people who saw me as a burden. The transformation had already begun. I could feel it in the way I held my shoulders, in the steadiness of my hands on the steering wheel. I was no longer the woman who'd accepted sleeping in a car because her daughter was too busy to care. The California sun felt like forgiveness against my face as I stepped off the plane at LAX. For 3 months, I'd lived under Ohio's gray winter sky, sleeping in the shadow of abandoned buildings and strip malls. Here, even in December, the air carried warmth and the promise of new beginnings. Harrison, Blackwell, and Associates had arranged for a car service to take me directly to the property. The driver, a weathered man named Pedro White, spoke with the easy familiarity of someone who'd lived in Los Angeles his entire life. "First time in California?" he asked, navigating the freeway with practiced ease. First time in 40 years, I replied, watching palm trees flash past the window like exclamation points against the blue sky. What brings you back? An inheritance. The word still felt foreign in my mouth, from an aunt I barely knew. Pedro's eyes found mine in the rearview mirror. Funny how family works sometimes. The ones you think you can count on disappoint you, and the ones you forget about save your life. I thought about Jane's text messages, cheerful updates about nursery shopping and mortgage pre-approvals, sent to a woman sleeping in a car. Yes, I said quietly. Funny how that works. The house on Craftsman Avenue exceeded the photographs. A 1920s bungalow with original hardwood floors and built-in bookcases. It sat on a corner lot shaded by ancient oak trees. The front porch wrapped around two sides of the house, and despite needing paint and some obvious repairs, it had the solid bones of a home built to last. Attorney Robert Rice met me at the front gate, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked genuinely surprised when I climbed out of the car service rather than a luxury vehicle. Ms. Qualls? I was expecting, well, someone different. I looked down at my worn jeans and thrift store sweater, the nicest clothes I owned. Different how? Your aunt spoke of you often in her final years. She made it sound like you were quite successful, established. I assumed. He trailed off, perhaps noticing the way I gripped the gate for support as I looked at the house that was now mine. My aunt was remembering me from 40 years ago, I said. People change. Circumstances change. Inside, the house told the story of a woman who'd lived alone, but not lonely. Every room was filled with books, plants, and carefully chosen antiques. The kitchen had been updated sometime in the 1990s, and while dated, everything was clean and functional. Aunt Tilly had left behind not just a house, but a complete life. The neighbors have been maintaining the yard and collecting mail, Mr. Rice explained as we walked through rooms that smelled of lavender and old books. Mrs. Johnson next door has a key. She's been quite concerned about what would happen to the place. In the master bedroom, I found photographs on the dresser. Tilly as a young woman, then middle-aged, then elderly, but always smiling. In several pictures, she wasn't alone. A tall woman with silver hair appeared in photos spanning decades. Companions at dinner tables, on vacation, gardening together in what I recognized as this very backyard. Was my aunt married? I asked. Mr. Saar. Rice cleared his throat. She shared her life with someone. Yes. Patricia Meek. They were together for 37 years before Patricia passed in 2019. Your aunt never quite recovered from that loss. I picked up a photograph of the two women, both in their 70s, hands intertwined as they sat on this same front porch. The love between them was visible even in a still image. The way Tilly leaned into Patricia. The way Patricia's thumb traced circles on Tilly's knuckles. Did Patricia have family? A son in Oregon who never visited. He contested the will when Patricia left everything to your aunt. Quite bitter about it, according to Tilly. I understood then why Tilly had chosen me. Not because we'd been close, but because we'd both learned that family wasn't always about blood, and that love given freely was rarer than love expected by right. The paperwork took hours. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, insurance policies, a paper trail of a life carefully planned and responsibly managed. Tilly had been a retired teacher who'd invested wisely and lived modestly. She'd owned this house outright for 15 years. The liquid assets total $347,000 after taxes and fees, Mr. Rice explained. The house is valued at $865,000, though in this market it could sell for considerably more. Your aunt also maintained a small life insurance policy that brings the total inheritance to just over $1.2 million. The numbers felt abstract, like prices for items in a store I'd never imagined shopping in. But what felt real was the house around me, the weight of keys in my palm, the knowledge that I had a home again. After Mr. Rice left, I walked through the rooms again, this time alone. In the kitchen, I found a note taped to the refrigerator in careful handwriting. For the neighbor who feeds the plants and collects my mail, there's wine in the pantry and cookies in the blue tin. Help yourself. Tea. I knocked on the door of the house next door. A woman in her 70s answered, her face lighting up when I introduced myself. You're Tilly's niece. Oh, honey, she talked about you constantly. Louise this, Louise that. She was so proud of you. Ah, the woman, Sharon Clayton, ushered me inside for coffee and what turned out to be 3 hours of stories about my aunt. She worried about you, especially this past year, Sharon said. Said she had a feeling you were going through something difficult. She wanted to reach out but didn't want to intrude. Louise is strong, she'd say, but everyone needs help sometimes. I thought about the months I'd spent sleeping in my car, the careful rationing of every dollar, the slow erosion of dignity that comes with having nowhere to go. Tilly had somehow sensed my struggle from 2,000 miles away, while my own daughter, living 30 minutes from me, had seen it as an inconvenience to her expanding lifestyle. She changed her will 6 months ago, Sharon continued, added a provision that if anything happened to her, I should watch for you. She said you might not know about the inheritance right away, and you might need extra kindness when you arrived. That evening, I stood on Tilly's front porch, my front porch, and called Jane for the first time since arriving in California. Mom! Finally! I was starting to worry. Where are you? California, I said simply. California? What are you doing there? Did you find a job? Something like that. I watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that I'd forgotten existed. I inherited a house. Silence. Then, what do you mean, inherited? My Aunt Tilly died. She left me her house and some money. Aunt Tilly? I thought she died years ago. How much money? There it was. Not, I'm so sorry for your loss, or how wonderful that you have a home again. Just, how much money? Enough, I said. Well, that's fantastic news. Frank and I were just talking about how we could help you get back on your feet. This solves everything. When are you coming home? Home. As if the car I'd been sleeping in for 3 months was home. As if the parking lot behind a defunct grocery store was where I belonged. I'm not sure I am coming home, Jane. Another pause. What do you mean? Your life is here. Emma misses her grandmother. And with the new baby coming, you seem to manage just fine with me sleeping in my car for 3 months. Mom, that's not fair. We offered to let you stay with us. For 6 weeks. Until Frank got tired of seeing me. That's not... Look, maybe we didn't handle things perfectly, but we're family. This inheritance is wonderful, but you don't need to run away to California. We can help you find a nice place here, close to us. Close to them. Close enough to be convenient when they needed babysitting or help with household projects, but not so close as to be a daily reminder of their capacity for callousness. I need to think about things, I said. Think about what? Mom, you're not making sense. Come home. We'll figure this out together. But as I looked out at the garden Tilly and Patricia had planted together, at the neighborhood where people left notes for each other and watched over empty houses, I realized I might already be home. I'll call you in a few days, I said, and hung up before Jane could respond. That night, I slept in a real bed for the first time in months. Tilly's bed, in Tilly's house, surrounded by the accumulated comfort of a life well lived. The sheets smelled like lavender, and through the open window I could hear the gentle rustle of orange trees in the backyard. But sleep didn't come easily. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Jane, each one more urgent than the last. Mom, call me back. We need to talk about this properly. Frank thinks you're not thinking clearly. Frank thinks. Of course, Frank had an opinion about my inheritance, about my choices, about my life. Frank, who'd left notes about utility bills when I was homeless. Frank, who was now, according to Jane's earlier texts, looking at bigger houses and planning bigger families. I turned off my phone and lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of my new neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the night. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights briefly illuminating the bedroom walls. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of building a new life. Tomorrow, I would decide who deserved to be part of it. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was warm, safe, and sleeping in a place that belonged to me. Tonight, I was no longer the woman who'd accepted sleeping in a car because her daughter was too busy to care. 3 weeks in California had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. My skin had lost the gray pallor of Ohio winter and homeless nights. My shoulders no longer carried the permanent hunch of someone expecting disappointment. When I caught my reflection in Tilly's antique mirrors, I saw glimpses of the woman I'd been before the flood, before Frank's passive-aggressive notes, before I'd learned to make myself small enough to fit into other people's definition of convenient. I'd started each morning with coffee on the front porch, watching Sharon Clayton tend her garden next door. She'd wave and call out updates about neighborhood happenings, the Garcia's new baby, the Johnsons' kitchen renovation, the book club that met every Thursday at the community center. Ordinary life, the kind I'd forgotten existed during my months of survival mode. The house itself was becoming mine through small daily choices. I'd moved Tilly's collection of mystery novels to make room for the few books I'd salvaged from the flood. I'd rearranged the kitchen to suit my left-handed cooking style. Most significantly, I'd hung my mother's quilt, the only piece of family history I'd managed to save, on the living room wall where afternoon light would catch its faded colors. My phone had been mercifully quiet for days after I'd stopped responding to Jane's increasingly frantic messages. But this morning, as I sat with my coffee watching Sharon deadhead her roses, it rang with Jane's number. "Mom, thank God. I've been worried sick. I'm fine, Jane. Just settling in." Settling in? What do you mean settling in? You can't just disappear to California and expect us not to worry. Emma keeps asking where Grandma went. The mention of Emma sent a familiar pang through my chest. My granddaughter's sweet face, her delight in simple games and bedtime stories. But even that love had been filtered through Jane's convenience. Visits scheduled around her social calendar, interactions monitored for signs that I might be staying too long or expecting too much. "How is Emma?" I asked. "She's fine, but that's not the point. The point is you running away instead of dealing with reality. Frank and I have been talking, and we think you should come home immediately. This whole California thing is just escapism. Frank and I have been talking. As if Frank's opinion about my life mattered. As if the man who'd made me feel unwelcome in my own daughter's home had any right to judge my choices. What reality am I avoiding exactly? You can't just play house in some dead woman's home and pretend your real life doesn't exist. You have responsibilities here. Family here. I had no family when I was sleeping in my car." "Oh, don't be so dramatic. That was temporary. We were figuring things out. For 3 months, Jane. I was homeless for 3 months while you figured things out. And now you're not. Problem solved. So sell the house, take the money, and come home where you belong. Where I belong." In Jane's world, I belonged wherever was most convenient for her, close enough to provide free babysitting and holiday help, distant enough not to interfere with her real life. "I like it here," I said simply. "You don't even know anyone there." "I'm getting to know people. The neighbors are lovely." "Neighbors aren't family, Mom." "No," I said, thinking of Sharon's daily waves, of the woman at the hardware store who'd spent an hour helping me choose the right paint for the front porch, of the book club members who'd already invited me to join them. Sometimes they're better. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jane spoke, her voice tight with frustration. "Fine. You want to have your little adventure, go ahead. But don't expect us to keep your life on hold indefinitely. Frank got the promotion, remember? We're looking at houses. Real houses. Not some old lady's leftover life. Congratulations on Frank's promotion," I said, meaning it less than she probably thought. "We're actually flying out there next weekend." My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. "What?" "We found tickets on sale. Frank has some vacation days to use up before the end of the year. We thought we'd come see this famous house, help you get your head on straight. Maybe look at the real estate market while we're there. Help me get my head on straight." As if moving from homelessness to home ownership represented confused thinking rather than miraculous good fortune. "I don't think that's a good idea, Jane." "Why not? We're family. We want to see where you're living, make sure you're safe. And frankly, Mom, some of the things you've been saying lately worry us. This whole cutting off contact thing isn't like you. It wasn't like the old me." She was right about that. The old me would have been grateful for any attention, any suggestion that I mattered enough to worry about. The old me would have spent the week cleaning frantically and shopping for groceries I couldn't afford to make sure Jane and Frank felt welcomed and comfortable. But the old me had slept in a car for 3 months while her daughter planned nursery renovations. "When are you arriving?" I asked. "Saturday afternoon. We'll get a hotel near you, somewhere nice. Frank found this great place that's not too expensive if we use his work discount." Of course they'd stay in a hotel. Not because my house wasn't big enough. Tilly's guest room was lovely. But because staying with me would require acknowledging that this was actually my home, not just a temporary delusion they needed to cure me of. "I'll pick you up at the airport," I heard myself say. Perfect. "Oh, Mom, you'll see. Once you spend some time with us, remember what you're missing, you'll realize this whole California thing is just grief talking. Grief makes people do strange things." After I hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time, watching Sharon work in her garden. Eventually, she noticed my stillness and came over to the low fence that separated our yards. "Everything all right, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." "My daughter's coming to visit." Sharon's face brightened. "How wonderful. You must be excited." "I should be. But you're not." I found myself telling Sharon about the phone call, about Jane's assumption that I was having some kind of breakdown that needed correcting, about Frank's opinions and their plans to help me get my head on straight. Sharon listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding in understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, pruning shears idle in her hands. "You know," she said finally, "Tilly went through something similar when she first moved here. Her sister, your mother, I suppose, came to visit about 6 months after Tilly and Patricia bought this house. Came with her husband and a whole lot of opinions about Tilly's lifestyle choices. I'd never heard this story." "What happened?" "Oh, they had quite the visit. Lots of suggestions about how Tilly should live, who she should be. They stayed 3 days and spent most of it trying to convince her to move back to Ohio, find a nice man, live a normal life." Sharon snipped a dead rose with more force than necessary. "Tilly told me afterward that she learned something important that week." "What?" "That love doesn't try to change you back into who you used to be. Real love celebrates who you're becoming." That afternoon, I drove to a hardware store in a neighboring town, one where nobody knew me yet. I bought new locks for the front and back doors, good ones, the kind that couldn't be easily bypassed. The elderly man behind the counter, Lloyd Hardy, helped me choose the right tools and gave me detailed instructions for installation. "Changing locks is one of the most empowering things a woman can do," he said as he rang up my purchase. "Makes a house truly yours." I spent the evening installing the new locks, working slowly and carefully with Tilly's toolbox and Lloyd's instructions. It was satisfying work, requiring focus and precision that left no room for anxiety about the coming weekend. When I finished, I stood in the entryway, turning my new keys in their new locks, listening to the solid click of tumblers falling into place. Saturday morning, I woke early and spent extra time getting ready. I chose my outfit carefully. A blue dress I'd bought the week before, the first new clothing I'd purchased in months. It fit well and made me look competent, settled, like a woman who belonged in her own home. The airport was chaos, holiday travelers and delayed flights creating an atmosphere of barely controlled stress. I found Jane and Frank at baggage claim, both looking tired and irritated from their journey. Jane hugged me briefly, then stepped back to study my face with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspicious packages. "You look different," she said. I look rested. Frank gave me a perfunctory hug and immediately began complaining about the flight, the airport, the California traffic he'd heard horror stories about. I listened politely as I led them to my car, not the old Honda, which I'd traded for a reliable used Prius the week before. "Nice car," Frank said with surprise. "The inheritance must have been bigger than you told Jane." It was a casual comment, but it revealed everything. They weren't here out of concern for my well-being. They were here to assess my assets, to understand exactly what I'd inherited and how it might benefit them. "Big enough," I said, echoing my previous non-answer to Jane. During the drive to their hotel, Jane kept up a steady stream of chatter about their house hunt, Frank's promotion, their expanding family plans. It was clear they'd rehearsed this presentation. designed to remind me of everything I was missing by staying in California. "We found this amazing house," Jane said. "4 bedrooms, perfect for our growing family. The only problem is it's a bit of a stretch financially, even with Frank's raise. We're thinking about asking family for help with the down payment." There it was, the real reason for their visit, delivered with the practiced casualness of people who'd learned to wrap requests for money in concern about family obligations. I pulled into the hotel parking lot and helped them with their luggage, agreeing to pick them up for dinner in 2 hours. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of them in my rearview mirror, standing close together on the sidewalk, clearly discussing strategy for the evening ahead. But I had strategies of my own now. I was no longer the desperate woman who'd been grateful for 6 weeks of grudging shelter. I was someone with a home, with choices, with the power to say no. Dinner at Pasadena's finest restaurant had been Frank's suggestion. A place expensive enough to demonstrate that they weren't struggling financially, just strategically seeking help with their investment in a forever home. Jane had worn her newest dress, and Frank had spent the first 20 minutes discussing his promotion in terms that suggested he was practically running the company now. I'd listened politely, making appropriate sounds of congratulation while watching them perform their careful choreography of success. They were good at it, I had to admit. The perfect young couple with expanding dreams that just needed a little family support to become reality. "The house we're looking at is really an investment," Frank explained as he cut his steak with surgical precision. "Property values in that neighborhood have increased 30% in the last 5 years. With the new baby coming, we need the space, but we're also thinking long-term, building wealth for the family." "It sounds wonderful," I said. Jane leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I wish you could see it, Mom. It has this incredible kitchen with an island, and the master suite has a sitting area that would be perfect for nursing the baby. The backyard is huge. Emma would have so much room to play. And there's a separate living space over the garage," Frank added casually. "Perfect for extended family visits. You could stay as long as you wanted when you come to visit." Extended family visits. A polite way of saying I could be a guest in their home when they needed something, but never truly welcome to stay. The carrot to go with the stick they'd been wielding since my arrival in California. "How much help are you looking for?" I asked directly. They exchanged a glance, so quick I might have missed it 3 months ago, but homelessness had taught me to read the subtle communications between people who saw me as a problem to be managed. "Well," Jane said carefully, "we were hoping for maybe 50,000. 60 at the most, just for the down payment. We'd pay you back, of course, once Frank's next promotion comes through." $60,000. More than I'd had in my bank account in my entire life before Tilly's inheritance. Money they'd calculated I could afford because they'd done the math on my new circumstances without ever asking about my plans for the future. "That's a significant amount," I said. "But you have it," Frank said, his tone suggesting this made the decision obvious. "And it's family. This is what family does for each other. Family." The word they'd weaponized since my arrival in California, using it to justify their assumption that my inheritance should solve their problems. "Tell me about Emma," I said, changing the subject. "How is she adjusting to the idea of being a big sister?" Jane's face softened immediately. "Oh, she's so excited. She keeps patting my belly and talking to the baby. Yesterday she told me she wants to teach the baby how to color." For a moment, I saw my daughter as she'd been when Emma was born. Exhausted but glowing, so proud of her perfect baby girl. Before Frank's promotion became her primary concern, before house hunting consumed her weekends, before my homelessness became an inconvenience to be managed. "I miss her," I said quietly. "Then come home," Jane said immediately. "That's what we've been trying to tell you. Emma needs her grandmother. This new baby will need you too. You're running away from the people who love you most." "Am I? Because when I was sleeping in my car, neither of you seemed to think Emma needed her grandmother very badly." Frank's jaw tightened. "That's not fair, Louise. We offered you our guest room. For 6 weeks. Until I became inconvenient. You weren't inconvenient. You were—" He paused, clearly searching for diplomatic language. "You were going through a difficult time. Sometimes people in crisis need professional help, not just family support. Professional help. As if my homelessness had been a mental health crisis, rather than the natural result of losing everything in a flood and having nowhere else to go. I wasn't having a breakdown, Frank. I was having a housing crisis. And now you're not, Jane said brightly. So let's move forward. You have this beautiful inheritance. We have this amazing opportunity with the house. And Emma has grandparents who want to be part of her life. It all works out perfectly. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment away from their carefully orchestrated presentation. In the mirror, I looked at the woman I'd become, no longer hollow-cheeked and desperate, but not yet entirely sure of her own power. I thought about Tilly and Patricia, who'd built a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I thought about Sharon, who'd chosen to befriend a stranger simply because kindness was her nature. And I thought about the new locks on my doors, the keys that belonged only to me. When I returned to the table, Frank was showing Jane something on his phone. Photos of the house they wanted to buy, probably. Or mortgage calculators that demonstrated how my money would make their dreams possible. I'd like to see where you're living, Jane said as I sat down. Tomorrow, before we fly back. Of course. Maybe we could stay the night, Frank suggested. Save on the hotel bill? Get a real feel for the neighborhood? There it was. The assumption that my home was available to them, that my space could be occupied without permission because we were family, and family didn't need to ask. I'm sorry, but that won't be possible, I said. Why not? Jane's eyebrows drew together in confusion. Is the house not habitable or something? The house is perfectly habitable. I just prefer to keep my own space. But we're your family, Frank said, as if this explained everything. Yes, you are. And you have a hotel room. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. I could see Jane processing this refusal, trying to understand how the mother who'd accepted sleeping in a car rather than impose on anyone had suddenly developed boundaries. You're being ridiculous, she said finally. We flew all the way out here to see you, and you won't even let us stay one night in your house? You flew out here to assess my inheritance and convince me to give you money for yours. Frank's face flushed red. That's not... We're concerned about you. You're not acting like yourself. You're right, I said. I'm acting like someone who's learned the difference between being wanted and being useful. Jane's eyes filled with tears. Real ones, I thought, though I was no longer certain I could tell the difference. How can you say that? You're my mother. I love you. I know you do. But your love comes with conditions I'm no longer willing to meet. What conditions? What are you talking about? The condition that I be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you're willing to give me. The condition that I not expect too much, ask for too much, need too much. The condition that my needs always come second to your convenience. I reached for my purse, pulling out my wallet to pay for dinner. It was a small gesture, but symbolic. I was no longer someone who needed others to pick up the check. I'll drive you back to your hotel, I said. The ride was silent except for Jane's occasional sniffles and Frank's muttered complaints about California traffic. When I pulled up to their hotel entrance, Jane turned to me with the expression she'd perfected as a teenager. Part wounded innocence, part manipulative desperation. Mom, please, don't let some old woman's house come between us. Don't let money change who we are as a family. Some old woman's house. As if Tilly had been nothing more than a convenient benefactor. As if her carefully preserved home was just a windfall to be liquidated. Money didn't change who we are, Jane. It revealed who we've always been. Frank got out of the car without a word, but Jane lingered, her hand on the door handle. We'll come by tomorrow morning before our flight, she said. Maybe you'll feel differently after you've had time to think. Maybe, I said, though we both knew I wouldn't. That night, I sat on Tilly's front porch with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood settle into evening quiet. Sharon's house was dark. She'd mentioned going to her daughter's for the weekend. But other windows glowed with warm light, families going about their Sunday evening routines. My phone buzzed with a text from Jane. I love you, Mom. I hope you remember that. I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on, I love you too. That's why this hurts so much. But I didn't send it. Instead, I turned off my phone and went inside, locking my new locks behind me. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. The moment when I would have to choose between the family I'd been born into and the life I was building for myself. For the first time since Jane's call announcing their visit, I felt ready for that choice. I'd spent months learning to survive on scraps, of shelter, of dignity, of love. I'd forgotten that I deserved better until Tilly's inheritance reminded me that some people understand the difference between charity and care, between obligation and genuine affection. In the morning, Jane and Frank would arrive expecting the mother and mother-in-law they'd always known. Grateful, accommodating, willing to sacrifice for their happiness. Instead, they would meet the woman I was becoming, someone who understood her own worth, someone who'd learned that the most radical act of self-love is refusing to accept less than you deserve. The locks were changed. The boundaries were set. Tomorrow, I would discover whether love could survive the loss of convenient exploitation, or whether some relationships only work when one person holds all the power. I woke before dawn and made coffee in Tilly's kitchen, watching the sky lighten over the San Gabriel Mountains. In a few hours, Jane and Frank would arrive for what they undoubtedly expected to be a final negotiation, one last chance to convince the confused old woman to see reason and remember her family obligations. But I wasn't confused. For the first time in months, possibly years, I saw everything with perfect clarity. By 9 o'clock, I was dressed and ready. I'd chosen my clothes with the same care I'd taken the day before. The navy dress that made me look competent and successful, paired with the pearl earrings Tilly had left in her jewelry box. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who belonged in this house, who'd earned her place in this life. Sharon had returned from her daughter's house the night before, and I could see her moving around her kitchen, probably preparing for the day ahead. Part of me wanted to tell her what was coming, to have an ally nearby when the confrontation began, but this was something I needed to handle alone. At 9:47, a rental car pulled into my driveway. Jane and Frank emerged looking tired and slightly hungover, too much wine with dinner as they'd planned their strategy, perhaps. Frank carried a briefcase which struck me as both pathetic and telling. He'd brought documentation to a family visit, papers to support whatever argument they'd rehearsed. I opened the door before they could knock, stepping onto the porch instead of inviting them inside. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "How was your hotel?" "Fine," Jane said, her eyes scanning the house behind me as if looking for an opening to slip past my guard. "Can we come in? We don't have much time before our flight." "Actually, I think the porch is perfect for our conversation." Frank's jaw tightened with irritation. "Louise, it's 40 degrees out here." "It's 58 degrees and sunny, quite pleasant for December." I settled into one of the wicker chairs Tilly had arranged for watching sunsets. After a moment's hesitation, Jane and Frank took the remaining chairs, though both looked uncomfortable with this outdoor negotiation. "Mom," Jane began, her voice taking on the patient tone she'd probably practiced. "We talked after dinner last night, and we want to apologize if we came on too strong about the house thing. We know you're still adjusting to your new situation. My new situation. As if inheriting a beautiful home and financial security was a medical condition that needed managing. I'm adjusting quite well, actually." "That's wonderful," Frank said, opening his briefcase with unnecessary flourish. "But we want to make sure you're thinking about the big picture. Long-term planning, you know. At your age, it's important to consider how to maximize your assets. At my age. I was 62, not 92, but in Frank's mind, I was apparently too elderly to make financial decisions without his guidance. "What kind of long-term planning did you have in mind?" Frank pulled out a folder thick with papers, printouts of real estate listings, mortgage calculations, investment projections. He'd done his homework. I had to give him that. "Well, for starters, this house is way too big for one person. The maintenance costs alone must be eating into your inheritance. And California taxes?" He shook his head as if personally wounded by the state's tax structure. "You could sell this place, buy something smaller and more practical in Ohio, and still have hundreds of thousands left over to help your family build wealth." "Help my family build wealth," I repeated slowly. "Exactly." Jane leaned forward eagerly. "It's about creating generational wealth. What's the point of having all this money if it just sits here while your family struggles with mortgages and daycare costs? Are you struggling, Jane? She blinked, apparently not expecting the direct question. Well, no, not struggling exactly. But with the baby coming and Frank's career trajectory, we need to position ourselves for success. The house we want isn't just about us. It's about creating the right environment for Emma and the new baby. Good schools, safe neighborhood, room to grow? And you think I should subsidize this positioning? We think you should invest in your grandchildren's future, Frank said smoothly. Instead of rattling around in some dead woman's house playing make-believe about starting over at 62. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Even the morning birds seemed to have paused their singing. Jane's face went pale as she realized Frank had crossed a line they'd probably agreed he wouldn't cross. Frank, she said quietly. That's not… No, let him finish, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. I'm curious about this make-believe life I'm apparently living. Frank, emboldened by what he mistook for calm acceptance, leaned back in his chair. Look, Louise, I get it. You've had a rough few months. The flood, the temporary housing situation, it was all very traumatic. But you can't just run away to California and pretend to be someone you're not. You're a grandmother from Ohio, not some California lifestyle woman. This whole thing is just postponing the inevitable return to reality. And what reality is that? That you belong near your family. That your purpose is supporting the next generation, not playing house with someone else's life. There it was. The truth underneath all their careful maneuvering. In Frank's mind, my value was entirely utilitarian. I existed to provide free childcare, holiday hosting, and now financial support for their ambitions. The idea that I might have my own dreams, my own right to happiness, was literally inconceivable to him. I looked at Jane, who was staring at her hands, unwilling to meet my eyes. She wasn't disagreeing with Frank's assessment. She was just embarrassed that he'd stated it so baldly. You know what's interesting? I said conversationally. 3 months ago, I would have agreed with you. I would have sold this house, moved back to Ohio, and handed you whatever money you asked for. I would have been grateful that you still wanted me in your lives, even after proving how much of a burden I could be. Mom, Jane started, but I held up a hand. But then I learned something important. Do you know what it was? Neither of them answered. I learned that some people invite you into their lives, and some people just tolerate your presence until it becomes inconvenient. I learned the difference between being loved and being useful. I stood up, smoothing my dress, feeling the solid weight of my house key in my pocket. Jane, I love you. I love Emma. I will love the new baby, but I won't subsidize your life while you treat mine as disposable. We're not treating your life as disposable, Jane protested, finally looking up. We want you to be part of our lives. That's what this whole conversation is about. No, this conversation is about you wanting my money. If you wanted me to be part of your lives, you wouldn't have let me sleep in my car for 3 months while you shopped for bigger houses. Frank snorted derisively. Here we go again with the car thing. You act like we threw you out on the street. You didn't throw me out. You just made it clear I wasn't welcome to stay. Because you were… Frank caught himself, but I could see the words he'd been about to say. Depressing, negative, a burden. I was what, Frank? You were going through something we couldn't fix, Jane said quickly. We thought some space might help you get perspective. And now I have perspective. I can see quite clearly that you view my inheritance as a solution to your problems rather than my reward for surviving yours. I walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the neighborhood Tilly and Patricia had chosen for their life together. Sharon was watering her plants, and she waved when she saw me. I waved back, feeling the simple pleasure of being seen and acknowledged by someone who expected nothing from me but friendliness. So what happens now? Jane asked, and I could hear real fear in her voice for the first time. Now you go catch your flight home. You buy whatever house you can afford on Frank's salary. You raise your children and build your life without expecting me to bankroll it. And us? Jane's voice was small. What happens to us? I turned back to face her, seeing not the manipulative woman who'd orchestrated this weekend's performance, but the little girl who'd once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort and reassurance. That depends entirely on whether you can love me without expecting me to be grateful for the privilege. Frank was gathering his papers, his face red with anger and frustration. This is ridiculous. You're throwing away your family over money. I'm not throwing away anything, Frank. I'm refusing to purchase love that should be freely given. Fine, he snapped, standing abruptly. But don't come crying to us when this California fantasy falls apart and you're alone with nothing but your pride. I've been alone before, I said quietly. It's not as frightening as you think. Jane stood more slowly, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might acknowledge what they'd done to me and what they'd tried to do this weekend. Instead, she wiped her eyes and lifted her chin with a gesture I recognized from her childhood. Defensive pride masquerading as strength. I hope you're happy, she said. I'm getting there. I stood on the porch and watched them load their luggage into the rental car. Jane looked back once as they pulled out of the driveway, but Frank stared straight ahead, already planning his next strategy, no doubt. After they disappeared around the corner, I sat back down in Tilly's chair and pulled out my phone. I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, but I deleted them all without reading them. Instead, I opened my contacts and scrolled to a number I'd memorized but never used. Mr. Rice answered on the second ring. Louise, how are you settling in? Very well, thank you. I have a question about making changes to my will. There was a brief pause. Of course. What kind of changes? I want to establish a scholarship fund for women over 50 who are starting over after losing everything, and I want to leave the house to someone who will appreciate what Tilly and Patricia built here. I can draft something for you. Do you have a beneficiary in mind? I looked over at Sharon's house, where she was now deadheading roses with the patient care of someone who understood that beautiful things required tending. Yes, I said. I think I do. That evening, I called the book club Sharon had mentioned and asked about joining. The woman who answered, Anna Whitmire, seemed delighted to welcome a new member. We're reading Late Bloomers next month, she said. Stories about women who found their power later in life. You'll fit right in. As the sun set over the San Gabriel Mountains, I sat on my porch with Tilly's copy of the book, reading about women who'd discovered that the second half of life could be entirely different from the first. The phone was silent. No frantic calls from Jane, no guilt-inducing messages about family obligations. The silence felt like freedom. Tomorrow, I would start planning the scholarship fund. I would tend Tilly's garden and maybe plant some flowers of my own. I would host the book club in a living room where my mother's quilt caught the afternoon light. I would live a life of my own choosing, surrounded by people who saw my presence as a gift rather than a burden. And if Jane and Frank ever learned to love without conditions, without expectations of financial return, they would be welcome in that life. But if they didn't, I would be just fine without them. The woman who'd slept in a car for 3 months was gone. In her place was someone who understood that dignity, once reclaimed, was worth more than any family's approval. The doors were locked, the will was changed, and I was finally, completely, home.